The intellectual error that destroys your ability to think. You think you're thinking right now. You're probably not. And I don't mean that as an insult. I mean it as a precise, clinical observation about what human brains actually do most of the time. Because what we call thinking is usually something else entirely. Something that feels identical to thinking from the inside. Something that produces confident conclusions, satisfying explanations, and the deep, comfortable sense that you understand what's happening. But it isn't thinking. It has a name, rationalization. And the terrifying part? The smarter you are, the better you are at it. Hold that. We're coming back to it. First, let me ask you something simple. When was the last time you genuinely changed your mind? Not updated a minor preference. I mean, changed your mind about something load-bearing. A political belief, a moral conviction, your assessment of someone you love. Think about it. If you're having trouble remembering, that's not an accident. That's the error. That's exactly what we're here to talk about. Now, let me tell you what's actually happening in your skull when you think you're reasoning. You encounter new information, a fact, an argument, a statistic, and your brain does something evolution built over millions of years of social living in small groups, where being wrong in public was genuinely dangerous. It checks. Does this fit? Does this fit what I already believe? Does this fit my identity? Does this fit what my tribe believes? If yes, accepted, integrated, filed as evidence. If no, rejected, discredited, filed as suspicious. And here's the brutal part. Your conscious mind doesn't see any of this happening. By the time you experience yourself reasoning about new information, the verdict is already in. What you experience as logical evaluation is actually the construction of a defense brief for a conclusion your brain reached half a second ago. That's not a metaphor. That's neuroscience. There was a researcher, Jonathan Haidt, moral psychologist. He'd present people with moral scenarios designed to trigger disgust without any clear logical basis. Things that felt wrong but were completely harmless. And he'd ask, "Why do you feel that way?" They'd explain, confidently, fluently, with complete conviction. Except the reasons they gave made no sense. They contradicted each other. And when Haidt pointed this out gently, methodically, people didn't say, I'm not sure why I feel this way. They made up new reasons, instantly, without pause, without any sense of fabricating. He called it the rationalization machine. Your brain is not a reasoning engine that occasionally makes mistakes. It's a belief protection engine that occasionally does genuine reasoning by accident. Strange, isn't it? Now, here's where Feynman comes in. Because Feynman spent his career bumping into exactly this problem. He called it fooling yourself. And he considered it the single most dangerous intellectual habit a scientist or a person could have. He once said something that should be carved into the entrance of every university in the world. The first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. Read that again. You are the easiest person to fool. The one doing the reasoning. The one most motivated to reach the conclusion you already favor. The one who, when an argument fails, simply builds another one. Think about that for a second. Now let me give you an experiment. A real one. Do it right now. Think of something you believe strongly. A political position. A dietary conviction. A belief about success or money. Got one? Now ask yourself, what would it take to change your mind about this? If you can answer quickly and specifically, good. You're reasoning. You have a falsifiable belief. But if the answer feels slippery, if you find yourself thinking, it would depend on the context, or I'd need to see a lot of evidence, or most telling if the question itself feels somehow threatening, like an attack, rather than an inquiry. There it is. That's the error. That slipperiness, that defensiveness, that sense that your belief is not subject to the same rules as other people's beliefs. That's not thinking. That's identity protection, wearing the costume of thought. Now let me tell you how this works in the brain. Because understanding the mechanism changes everything. You have two systems. Daniel Kahneman, Nobel Prize winner, called them System 1 and System 2. System 1 is fast, automatic, handles everything from recognizing faces to having an immediate emotional reaction to an argument before you've consciously processed it. System 1 has no interest in truth. It has interest in speed and survival. System 2 is slow, deliberate, effortful. It's what you use when you follow a complex logical argument or carefully weigh competing evidence. Here's what nobody tells you about System 2. It's lazy, not broken. Lazy. Because System 2 burns real metabolic energy. so your brain outsources whenever possible. It generates a quick emotional verdict, this feels right, or this feels wrong, and then uses system to, not to evaluate the verdict, but to justify it. You experience the justification as reasoning, but it's a press release. And the smarter you are, the more vocabulary you have, the more you've read, the better your press releases are. Intelligence, improperly used, is not a path to truth. It's a path to more convincing self-deception. Feynman saw this everywhere, in physicists who'd built their reputations on a particular theory and, when contradicting evidence emerged, found 17 reasons why the experiment was flawed. In his own mind, which he subjected to constant, almost violent scrutiny for exactly this tendency, he didn't trust himself. That was his secret. Not in an insecure way, in a precise, surgical way. He knew that the voice in his head saying, "Yes, that's right," was not always the voice of reason. Sometimes it was the voice of wishful thinking wearing a lab coat. Now here's the part that should genuinely disturb you. This error is not a defect. It was selected for. It was useful. For hundreds of thousands of years, in small tribes, consistency of belief was socially important. Changing your mind too easily made you untrustworthy. Defending your group's worldview even irrationally made you valuable. Your brain was built to win arguments, not to find truth. Let that sit. You were not equipped by evolution for the pursuit of accurate understanding. You were equipped for social navigation and survival. The pursuit of truth is a secondary application running on hardware optimized for something else entirely. Here's something nobody mentions. There was a famous experiment. Two groups of people were shown identical evidence about the effectiveness of capital punishment. One group believed it worked. The other believed it didn't. Both groups read the same studies. Both groups came away more convinced of their original position. Same evidence, more polarized conclusions. Because each group scrutinized the studies differently. The study that supported their view, they accepted its methodology. The study that contradicted it, they found the flaws, real ones. Because every study has flaws if you look hard enough. They applied intelligence selectively, like a lawyer who only looks for evidence that helps their client. That's motivated reasoning, and it operates in everyone, not just in people you disagree with, in you, in me, in the person you most respect intellectually. The only question is whether you've built habits to catch it. Feynman had those habits. Here's one of them. When you learn the term confirmation bias, or motivated reasoning, you feel equipped, you file it away, and then you start seeing it everywhere, in other people. That's the trap. The knowledge of the bias, improperly held, becomes a weapon for dismissing other people's arguments. That's just your confirmation bias. You've used the vocabulary of intellectual humility as intellectual aggression. The map of the territory mistaken for the territory itself. Feynman would find this hilarious, and then depressing, because the whole point is to catch it in yourself. The moment you feel smugly confident that you've identified someone else's rationalization, ask immediately, what am I rationalizing right now that I can't see? That question, that one question, is the entire practice. Now here's where it gets strange in a beautiful way. Think about real expertise. What do the best experts have that mediocre ones don't? Most people say, more knowledge, more facts, deeper familiarity with the literature. That's part of it. But here's what the best experts actually have. A finely calibrated sense of where their knowledge ends. They know which parts of their mental model are solid, which are shaky, which are load-bearing assumptions nobody has tested properly. The worst experts? They've forgotten where the knowledge ends. Their confidence is uniform maximum across the board, which is a statistical impossibility in any complex field where some things are well established and some are genuinely uncertain. Uniform confidence means the uncertainty has been paved over. And what paved it? Rationalization. The slow accumulation of automatic justifications that filled in the gaps so smoothly that the gaps became invisible. Feynman refused to let the gaps become invisible, kept poking them, kept admitting, in public, with no apparent embarrassment, I don't know. 3 words most experts find almost physically painful to say. Now let me give you the mechanism that makes this error so hard to escape. Rationalization doesn't feel like rationalization. It feels like clear thinking. It feels like finally seeing through the noise. It feels like arriving at truth. The emotional signature of rationalization is identical to the emotional signature of genuine insight. That click, that satisfying sense of pieces fitting together. Rationalization produces that feeling just as reliably as real understanding does, maybe more reliably. And here's what makes it almost poetic in a horrible way. Genuine insight often feels unsettling, destabilizing, like the ground shifting, like a piece of your worldview requiring reconstruction. Real understanding sometimes feels like loss. Rationalization always feels like winning. Your brain, every time you encounter new information, is choosing between these two paths. And the path that feels like winning is the easier one, the warmer one. Think about that for a second. There is a difference between holding a belief and being married to a belief. Most people don't know which category their beliefs fall into until something threatens them. Held beliefs. You can examine them, notice their weak points, revise them when evidence demands. They're tools. Married beliefs. They're part of your identity. Attacking them feels like attacking you. Evidence against them feels like aggression. How many of your beliefs are actually married beliefs disguised as held beliefs? Feynman escaped this partially. Never completely through something simple. He committed to being wrong in public. Said, "I was wrong about that." Easily, quickly, without apparent cost to his self-esteem. Not because he was humble in all things, he famously wasn't, but because he had decoupled his identity from his conclusions. His identity was in the process, in the questioning, in the refusal to be fooled. So when a conclusion changed, nothing important had changed. Schools teach you to have the right answers. They grade you on conclusions. They build your intellectual self-esteem around the product, not the process. And then you go into the world with a brain that protects its conclusions like territory, because those conclusions are you. That's not thinking. That's self-maintenance. Now here's something beautiful and strange. Feynman was famous for being right. Spectacularly, consistently right. And part of why he was right so often was precisely that he was willing to be wrong so easily. When you protect your conclusions, you stop updating them. They calcify. Correct in the context when they formed, increasingly misaligned with reality as evidence accumulates. When you hold conclusions lightly as working hypotheses, as best current models they stay alive. They can incorporate contradicting evidence, update, sharpen. The tightly held belief calcifies. The lightly held belief evolves, and the organism whose beliefs evolve navigates reality better than the one whose beliefs calcify. Every time. Think about the last argument you had. What were you trying to do? Most of us, honestly, were trying to win. Not find out who was right. Win. Feel the satisfaction of the other person conceding or falling silent. And this orientation toward winning is the error, not the specific position you held. The frame of winning and losing applied to a conversation about what's true. Because truth doesn't have a winner. Truth is what's left when you remove the egos. Two people, both trying to win, both with rationalization machines running full speed. They don't find truth. They perform conviction at each other, and nobody updates. Strange, isn't it? Here's the layer that makes this existential. This error doesn't just affect how you argue. It shapes what you notice. What information reaches your conscious mind at all. Your brain filters constantly. You receive roughly 11 million bits of information per second from your senses. Your conscious mind processes roughly 40. Your brain decides what to show you. And those decisions are biased toward confirming your existing models. Information that fits surfaces. Information that doesn't get deprioritized, filtered, forgotten before it's consciously seen. You are, to a measurable degree, seeing a version of reality constructed to be consistent with what you already believe. That's not paranoia. That's how a brain manages the impossible task of making sense of 11 million bits per second with a 40-bit conscious bandwidth. And Feynman's genius, one aspect of it, was his almost violent commitment to checking the model against the data, going back to raw experience, asking again and again, what is actually there? Not what does my model tell me should be there. Look at the data, he'd say. Not, what does the theory predict? But, what does the data actually say? Two questions that feel identical, that aren't. Here's what I find most astonishing about all of this. This error has been understood in its basic outline for a very long time. Francis Bacon described confirmation bias in 1620. Feynman talked about it his entire career. The modern cognitive science is just mechanistic detail on top of something philosophers noticed centuries ago. We've known about this for 400 years, and it hasn't gone away. Because knowing about a bias and being free from it are completely different things. You can know the word confirmation bias perfectly, define it, cite studies, teach a course on it, and still be running the same machinery in your own head. What partially suppresses it? Practice. Specific, deliberate, uncomfortable practice. The practice of asking, when you feel most certain, what would have to be true for me to be wrong? The practice of finding the strongest argument against your own position, not to defeat it, to feel its force. The practice of saying, I don't know, when you don't know, even when knowing would be more comfortable. The practice of treating your own mind as a system that needs calibration, not a window to truth, a lens with known distortions. Feynman calibrated constantly, not showing off, not intellectual aggression, calibration, checking the lens, looking for where the distortion was running. He wanted to know what was actually true, more than he wanted to feel right. That distinction, wanting truth more than wanting to feel right, is maybe the rarest intellectual commitment a person can make. And here's the dark part. The world does not reward it. In the short term, in social situations, in arguments, in politics, in many workplaces, the person who is certain, unwavering, who never says, I don't know, that person often wins, gets promoted, gets followed, gets believed. The person who says, I was wrong about that, or I don't know actually, that person often loses. We've built social environments that select for exactly the intellectual error we're describing. We reward confident rationalization. We penalize honest uncertainty. And the brains walking around in those environments learn the lesson. The rationalization machine gets a little stronger. Feynman refused this trade. He'd rather be actually right than appear right. Which brings us back to where we started. Touch your head. Seriously. Touch it. The skull under your fingers. Inside it. Right now. A brain is deciding what to show you. Defending conclusions you formed years ago for reasons you no longer remember. Building press releases for verdicts already rendered. Filtering 11 million bits per second down to 40. Constructing a model of reality shaped by identity and tribe and evolutionary pressures that have nothing to do with truth. And calling it thinking. That's not your fault. It's your hardware. But you are not required to simply run the factory settings. You can notice the process. You can build in friction. You can create habits that force the error into the light often enough to catch it sometimes. Not always. Not even most of the time. But sometimes is worth something. Ask what would change your mind. Find the best argument against your own position. Notice when certainty feels suspiciously comfortable. Pay attention to when disagreement feels like a personal attack, rather than an interesting data point. Those aren't natural instincts. They go against the grain of what your brain was built for. But that's what Feynman was. Someone who went against the grain of his own cognition, deliberately, daily, with something that looked like joy. Not because thinking clearly is comfortable, because it's real. And the most extraordinary thing he ever demonstrated in every lecture, every paper, every conversation, was that the pursuit of what's actually true, with no protection for your ego, with no commitment to prior conclusions, with no fear of being wrong in public, that pursuit is not a sacrifice. It's the most interesting way to be alive. Your brain is going to rationalize anyway. It's going to protect your beliefs, defend your identity, construct beautiful logical architectures around conclusions it reached emotionally half a second ago. The question is whether any part of you is watching, whether any part of you is asking, quietly, underneath the confident voice, is this actually true, or do I just need it to be? You've always had the ability to ask that question. Most of us were just never told it was the most important one. Now you know.